After serving more than 20 years on the faculties of McMaster University and Trinity Western University, Dr. Evans in 2002 was appointed as a Payzant Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Acadia Divinity College. Dr. Evans directed the MA program at Trinity Western, where in 1995 he founded the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. He now directs the Master of Arts program at Acadia Divinity College and gives leadership to the Hayward Lectures, of which today's conference is a part. Professor Evans has authored a number of books, including Luke, published by Hendrickson in the New International Biblical Commentary Series, Mark, published by Thomas Nelson in the Word Biblical Commentary Series, Jesus and His Contemporaries, published by E.J. Brill, Jesus and the Ossuaries, published by Baylor University Press, and Ancient Texts for New Testament Studies, published by Hendrickson. Dr. Evans has also edited a number of books, including Studying the Historical Jesus, published by Brill, The Gospels and the Scriptures of Israel, published by Sheffield Academic Press, The Bible Knowledge Background Commentary, published in 3 volumes by Cook Publications, and several books with Stanley Porter, such as The Scrolls and the Scriptures, Qumran, 50 Years After, published by Sheffield Academic Press, and the Dictionary of New Testament Background, published by InterVarsity Press. This dictionary, I might note, received a gold medallion. Professor Evans has appeared in several television documentaries, including one concerned with the newly discovered Gospel of Judas, which will air on the National Geographic Channel next weekend, and about which we will hear something today. I might also add a note that tomorrow night on Dateline, NBC's network, 8 p.m., you can tune in, and Dr. Evans was interviewed for that, and so we'll look forward to that tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. His paper this afternoon is entitled, Why Were the Extra-Canonical Gospels Excluded from the Canon? Dr. Evans.
I suggest you take this handout, this blue sheet that's in the folder, and you can follow along. That's one of the things we've been hearing a lot about in recent years, are these Gospels excluded from the canon. And with the various comments that have been made already this morning by Professor Charlesworth, who talked about writings ostensibly outside the canon, and what Dr. McDonald was just saying a few minutes ago about the diversity within the various codices and collected writings that early Christians read and treated as authoritative, I think we're now prepared for what I have to say right now. What about some of these Gospels that were on the edges of the emerging New Testament canon? And here are the big ones that are being talked about today. And of course, the last one, the Gospel of Judas, will be formally introduced to the world next week in Washington, D.C. But the Gospel of Thomas, we've been hearing about that for a century. And the Egerton Papyrus, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas. And there's my list, and it's on your handout, but some of you are probably thinking, wait a minute, I think one's missing. Have I left one out? What about the secret Gospel of Mark that Morton Smith, and there you see a picture of him in the upper right-hand corner, he says he found while doing a sabbatical period of study at the Mar Saba Monastery in the Judean wilderness. He says he found it in the late 1950s. While there, he announced this in the early 60s at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting. And here it is on the left. It was a book in poor shape. It's actually a Greek text from 1646. And in the back, what should have been a couple of blank pages at the end of this book, and that's the picture. And actually, if we can dim the lights a little bit, as long as it still works for the camera, you'll be able to see the screen a little better. And this is where the book comes to an end. You see the finis at the end, and then beginning here, plus the next 2 pages, we have a handwritten letter, supposedly from Clement of Alexandria, in which he mentions a secret edition of the Gospel of Mark. And so Smith then, cataloging his finds in the Mar Saba collection, he put his name in the upper right-hand corner and this is the only extant page, the front page of this 1646 edition of the Letters of Ignatius. He puts his name, Smith, and calls it document number 65. And this document for the last 40-some years has been taken very seriously. He published it text and commentary and translation in 1973. Secret Mark is a hoax. Analysis of handwriting samples shows the Marsaba text is certainly a forgery. No one had looked at the text with this kind of expertise. We biblical scholars may know a lot of things about biblical languages and a lot of stuff, but we are not normally handwriting experts, and we are not experts in the area of forgery. This text, some beautiful color photographs of it exist. The actual original pages have gone missing. But color photographs that are quite clear have been examined by handwriting experts. And you know what they conclude? The text is not written, it's drawn. Do you know what I mean by that? When you pick up a pen and you write in your own handwriting, you truly write. But what if you try to imitate a style of writing not your own? You no longer write, you draw. You slow down. And under the microscope, the handwriting expert sees what's called the forger's tremor. As you're making the letter follow the proper shape and curvature. That is observed throughout the manuscript. The telltale forger's tremor. Plus, slips in the Marsaba text involving certain Greek letters like the lambda, the L, and the tau, the T, happen to match the very distinctive way Morton Smith would write his tau and lambda. And how do we know this? Because he donated his library to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and he has in the margins his own handwriting, including his way of writing Greek. And he writes the T and the L, or the tau and the lambda, with a single stroke, which is very unusual. And occasionally, this Clementine letter, so-called, alleged, found in the back of this 1646 Greek text, has occasionally somebody who is imitating 18th century style Greek writing slips and, lo and behold, imitates Morton Smith and his distinctive way of writing T's and L's. No, that's Morton Smith very skillfully imitating 18th century Orthodox Greek handwriting, and occasionally he just can't help it. He slips and writes it his own way. Smith's account of his discovery parallels a fictional story published in 1940, and it was in his preface, in his own words, he says, I was invited to Marsaba in 1941. What gave him that idea? The year following, a book about a discovery of a Greek text at Marsaba. And then Morton Smith has the same experience, discovers a text. Not only that, distinctive ideas in the Marsaba text are in evidence of some of Smith's work published before his discovery. He was in possession of distinctive facts before the text in question was found. This book that I'm referring to by Scott Carlson, in my view, absolutely ends Secret Mark as a text that we should talk about as biblical scholars. I have nothing more to say about it. Now let's go to the ones listed on the handout. First, the Gospel of Thomas. Fragments of the Gospel of Thomas, 3 very important fragments were discovered in the 1890s at Oxyrhynchus, and they were published 100 years ago. We weren't sure if they were even related, but that Jesus said, and then there'd be a statement attributed to Jesus. And then he said something else. But it was not until the whole text was found in Coptic translation, we probably in late 1945, somewhere in there, shortly after World War II when it was found. There are disputes about exactly where and when, but in Egypt, in Coptic translation, in codices dating to sometime in the middle or late 4th century A.D., 13 leather-bound codices, one of which was destroyed and a few fragments survived. But in what we now call Codex number 2, Tractate number 2, is the Gospel of Thomas. And it's a Coptic translation of the entire work. What is Coptic? It's the Egyptian language, but using Greek, the Greek alphabet, plus a few other letters. And of course, we all know about Thomas, the doubter. And he became a popular figure in some circles, including early Gnostic circles. There are some scholars who think the Gospel of Thomas is very early, at least an early edition of it, earlier and perhaps even independent of the Synoptic Gospels. And so these are some of the best-known people supporting it, John Dominic Crossan, Charlie Hedrick, and Marvin Meyer. But I have some problems with Thomas. The esoteric orientation of it, the asceticism that's found in it, the fact that Thomas appears to know the New Testament, and the example I'm giving you right here is this is one of the Greek fragments of Thomas. It agrees verbatim with the Greek rendering in Luke 8:17, but here's what's significant about it. Luke is an improvement upon the saying in Mark. Mark's Greek, Mark 4:22, is a little bit clumsy. Luke's improved on it. Luke's improvement is what shows up in Thomas. Now, what does that tell you? That Thomas is independent of the synoptic tradition? Perhaps dates originally to the middle of the first century, as some have proposed? That isn't what it suggests to me. It suggests to me that the author of Thomas knows of Luke's improvement on Mark. So how does that make Thomas early and independent? I don't think it does. Then there's another troublesome thing, and this is recent research in this book by Nicholas Perrin. Here it is outlined. He's an expert in Syriac and the Syrian tradition, and he's made some remarkable discoveries. Thomas is acquainted with the Syriac tradition of the middle of the 2nd century. And one of the key elements, according to John Dominic Crossan, what has persuaded Crossan over the years that Thomas contains early independent material is that he can't account for the distinctive ordering principle, the arrangement and order of stuff in Thomas. So he's concluded that it must be independent of the New Testament. What Nicholas Perrin shows is that Thomas gets his distinctive order from Tatian's Diatessaron and other Syriac traditions from the Syrian church. And when you keep in mind the Syrian church is ascetic and elitist, there are these tendencies. Oh, Thomas begins to sound like a document that emerged in the middle of the 2nd century. And maybe that's why it's so familiar then with the New Testament. Over one half of the books of the New Testament, or what, I don't want to be anachronistic, but what later becomes the New Testament, 13, 14, maybe 15 books of the 27 books of the New Testament are quoted or alluded to in Thomas. All of this combines to suggest that Thomas can't be any earlier than the 2nd century. Not everybody here might agree with me on that, but I'm willing to argue for that vigorously. So I conclude Thomas probably contains little or no authentic tradition beyond what's already found in the New Testament Gospels. What about the Edgerton Papyrus? Purchased in 1934, edited and translated by these two great papyrologists, Idris Bell on the left and T.C. Skeet. Here's a close-up of one of those fragments. Plus a papyrus, it's called Papyrus Kuhn 255, seems to be a portion of it as well. We have some interesting features in this text, and I'm not sure if it helps us date Edgerton early, maybe later. We have what are called sacred names, abbreviations relating to sacred names, or nomina sacra. Here's an example of it, and if you read that, and we won't do it now, but you have some interesting combination of material. You have what sounds like John up here and Mark down here, plus a mistake or two. And so that's why I say it appears to draw on John 8 and Mark 1. In other words, Johannine and Synoptic tradition combined. What does that mean? Well, according to John Dominic Crossan, the Gospel of Mark depends directly on Edgerton. What? When the Markan evangelist sat down to write out what we call Mark, he has that document that you saw on his writing table. Now, Helmut Kester very prudently doesn't go that far, but he thinks the Edgerton Papyrus represents a pre-synoptic, pre-Johannine tradition where these materials relating to Jesus are together and have not yet bifurcated into synoptic and Johannine streams. I think there's a far easier explanation. Not only because Edgerton contains some real strange stuff. Jesus takes a handful of seed, he does something with it, and there's a remarkable, mysterious growth of fruit. which reminds me a lot of a story found in a late 2nd century document and later called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Don't get them confused, different documents. Does Edgerton really contain 1st century independent tradition that perhaps Mark made use of? I don't think so. Well, how do we explain the blending then of Johannine and Synoptic material? Real easy, just the same way we would explain it here. This is a quotation of Justin Martyr writing around somewhere between 150 and 160 A.D. He does the same thing. He says, and he makes it sound like this is a single statement, according to Jesus' word. Not everyone who says to me this, that, and the other thing. And notice, if you look at the parentheses, in this single word attributed to Jesus, according to Justin Martyr, 2nd century church father, he blends together synoptic and Johannine materials. He blends them together. See John 5 in the middle of that, Matthew, Luke. And yet, if you were to find this only as a papyrus in the sands of Egypt, I have no doubt Crossan would say, look at that. Pre-Johannine and synoptic materials before this bifurcation has taken place. Yet we know that's not true. This is Justin Martyr writing, 150, 160 A.D. Edgerton is like that. I don't think Edgerton goes to the 1st century. And that's my conclusion. What about the Gospel of Peter? It was discovered over 100 years ago, found in a 9th century sarcophagus. It begins with Pilate. I mean, we've lost the beginning of the work. It begins with Pilate washing his hands, as he does in the Gospel of Matthew. He yields to the mob, and if they want to crucify Jesus, they can. And we found some papyri that might be related to this document at Oxyrhynchus, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 2949 and 4009, and there are pictures of it. And, of course, we have John Dominic Crossan and Arthur Dewey and others, including Ben Johnson, a student of Helmut Kester in a dissertation, arguing that the Gospel of Peter represents early, independent Passion tradition. Crossan suggests it's a Passion story on which Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are dependent. Is that so? I have serious doubts about that. The problem is that the author of this document that we're calling, and I have a question mark there with it, we're calling the Gospel of Peter, is very ignorant of Jewish customs, ignorant of 1st century politics in Palestine, clearly influenced by Matthean editing or redaction, a tendency toward, well, what looks like Docetism and anti-Semitic tendencies. It appears to be a generation or two or three at least beyond the 1st century New Testament Gospels. And so there are people who have doubts about Peter. I'm proud to say I'm one of those doubters. But there's a new question that's been raised about Peter very recently. Is the gospel fragment found in the coffin of a 9th century monk really a copy of the 2nd century Gospel of Peter known to church fathers? The evidence is quite slim, and in fact has been recently called into question in Paul Foster's essay that came out just a couple months ago in New Testament Studies. Foster concludes, in answer to my question, probably not. What scholars have called the Gospel of Peter, on the assumption that it is the Gospel of Peter known to Bishop Serapion in the 2nd century, may in fact be a much later gospel, perhaps from the late Roman or early Byzantine period. Why was the identification of this gospel fragment found in a coffin from the 9th century, why was that identification made with Serapion's reference to a Gospel of Peter? Well, he says the Gospel of Peter has Peter speaking in the first person. And the Gospel text found in the coffin does too. Trouble is, we have found Gospel fragments of one sort or another since that have either Peter or one of the apostles speaking in the first person. We better be careful about making that identification. This may not be the document referred to by Serapion at all, in which case the argument that this document that we found goes to the 2nd century, never mind all the way back to the 1st century, that's a precarious argument. And, of course, if you've read the Gospel of Peter, this is the famous gospel where the cross comes out of the tomb on Easter morning, along with the two angels that help out the risen Jesus out of the tomb. And the heavenly voice says, "Have you preached to them that sleep?" And, of course, many of you pastors do that every Sunday. And is it the risen Jesus who answers the heavenly voice? No, it's the cross. The cross that's following him out of the tomb answers back, yes. That is a fantastic element, and in my view, argues against an early date, but argues for a very much later date. And, of course, we have the Gospel of Mary that's been also talked about much in popular literature and even scholarly literature in the last several years. Was Mary Magdalene Jesus' special friend? Well, according to the Papyrus Onyxarinchus 3525, apparently she was. Even Peter has to admit that she knows things, perhaps that Jesus did not teach the other disciples, so he asked her to tell them what Jesus had told her. So she gives a big, long Gnostic discourse, so typical to other 2nd century and later Gnostic materials, and Jesus frankly doesn't believe it. And he says, "I don't believe you." And she weeps. "You think I'm telling lies?" And Levi then rebukes Peter. "Peter, you're always angry. If the Savior regarded her worthy, who are you to despise her? For that one, having known her, loved her always and assuredly." And so Michael Bagent, Dan Brown, and others are seizing on this. They were lovers. Maybe they even had a child. Could that be the Holy Grail? And this is where this fantasy scholarship, pseudo-scholarship, comes from, this kind of stuff. Now, this is a real text. It's a valuable text. I think it tells us a lot about certain groups in the church in the 2nd century, but it doesn't tell us much about Mary and Jesus in the 1st century, and certainly doesn't tell us that they were lovers, even though some people like to suggest that or probe that possibility. I don't think Mary then represents early tradition, but rather a later tradition. And here you go. This is why you're all here. You're all waiting for it. The Gospel of Judas. Yes, that is dated. That is an online release just a little over 1 week ago, March 22. National Geographic Society has announced that it has helped a Swiss foundation recover, restore, transcribe, translate, and now publish in English translation with commentary and introduction, the Gospel of Judas. Now, I'm part of this group, and I'd been under a non-disclosure agreement, but because they've announced it, I can announce it now too. So I can tell you, as far as I know, you're the first group in Canada to get the skinny. Now, this is something we already knew about. This is from Irenaeus, Against Heresies. No secret here, but read that paragraph. In a context where he's complaining about the various heresies and attacking various Gnostic groups, he says, and I'll start a little further down, "On this account," they add, "they have been assailed by the Creator, yet no one of them has suffered injury. For Sophia was in the habit of carrying off that which belonged to her from them to herself. They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, these Gnostic truths, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas." That's what's been found. And because the Gospel of Judas matches this summary description by Irenaeus, writing in 180 AD, toward the end of the 2nd century, we are convinced that the Gospel of Judas that has turned up in a most unusual way, convoluted way, is indeed this document that Irenaeus is talking about. So we have a very close match, a far closer match than Serapian's reference to Gospel of Peter and then what we found in a monk's coffin in the 9th century. So here's the codex, what it looked like before being restored. This codex was discovered in 1972 through a variety of trying to sell it and theft and everything else. It was examined in 1983 in that condition, and photographs of a few pages were taken. But the text itself wasn't restored. Originally a text of over 100 pages, of which only 60 some odd pages apparently now are in custody and have been restored. And in these 60 some odd pages, Gospel of Judas, two other tractates we already knew about, and fragments of a fourth. The Gospel of Judas would be pages 32 to 58 in this document. That's the incipit, or the beginning of it. And now let's examine. So there you are. You're actually seeing a picture. You're a week ahead of the whole world. And now we can read the text. That's the opening line. And that's, remember I told you, this is Coptic, which is the Egyptian language using the Greek alphabet. So you can see the word, some of you can anyway, logos, right there at the beginning with that pe in front of it. So it's the secret account, or the secret word, if you wish, of the revelation, and that's another Greek loan word, apophasis, that Jesus, and of course that's Jesus, spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot, Judas Iscariotes, and that's how it begins. That's the incipit, which in ancient books was like a title almost, the way a book got underway. Now, near the end of the book, after Jesus selects Judas and gives him all kinds of revelation, just like Irenaeus said in his little paragraph summary, Jesus says to Judas, he tells Judas he will surpass the other disciples and you will exceed all of them. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Do you understand that? The real Jesus is this spirit of light that has come down from heaven, but the fleshly body is just some man that clothes me. And he's saying to Judas, you're going to sacrifice that body that clothes me so I can be released, you see, and return to my heavenly origin. And then the explicit, this is the final line of the last page of the work. And well, can you make it out? Yeah, I think you can. There is Judas right up there. You see his name. There's the O-U-D-A-S, that part of it. The iota barely can be made out. Judas, and a little bit of the word euangelion, Gospel of Judas. Now let's look at this text. You can see it better. And there it is. Again, the Coptic pe, but otherwise it's a Greek word that's been borrowed. Euangelion in Judas, the Gospel of Judas. And that's how the text ends. Conclusions. Now, these are very preliminary conclusions. I've been in possession of the text for 6 months. Been mulling it over and over, trying to figure out what is the value of this text. Everyone agrees it's 2nd century, perhaps written as early as 150. It is very similar to Gnostic writings of the 2nd century and later. It probably tells us nothing of the historical Jesus and the disciple who betrayed him. Well, maybe nothing. I'm actually exploring the possibility that it just might help us understand the Gospel of John when Jesus says to Judas, what you're about to do it quickly. But I'm still mulling that over, so you may hear more later. The National Geographic Channel will air a 2-hour documentary on this a week from tomorrow, April 9th, on the National Geographic Channel. If you happen to have it, you might find it very interesting. Concluding thoughts. The New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are clearly more ancient and more deeply rooted in the tradition of Jesus and his earliest followers. The preponderance of the evidence suggests that the extra-canonical Gospels date from the middle of the 2nd century, if not later, and that they are secondary and derivative and do not contain early independent tradition, as some say. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. And then on a canonical note, it is hard to fault the Church's decisions as to which Gospels to include in the canon of Scripture and which Gospels to exclude. In short, I think the Church made the right call. Thank you very much.